Greetings, Internet. Welcome to Parsing John. This is, I believe, video number 7, where we get to take all of our work from the Greek section of the series, where we went through and parsed chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, and we get to bring in our work on the Latin version from the Vulgate, also verses 1 through 5, and today we get to compare them to each other. Now, a few quick notes about translating and this video. I suppose I should start with this video and the future times where we're going to do this. Each time we finish essentially a paragraph of the chapter in the Greek version and in the Latin version, we're going to take a video to compare the two texts to each other to see how close they are, how far apart they are, what differences there are between them. And we're also going to talk about any themes that occur throughout the entirety of that paragraph that we didn't have time for in the individual shorter video. So this video will go on, and it's the future versions of this video, as long as they need to. I hope not very long. I think usually it'll be pretty quick. Yes, this text looks the same as the other one. We're good. So as for comparing these, when translating, there's a couple things that a translator is kind of obligated to do if you're going to be an honest translator. When you're taking something out of another language and putting it into your own, you have to essentially walk a very fine line between two different ways of presenting a text. Since we're not, in our work in these two, we weren't presenting a very polished text, we didn't have to worry about that, either of these issues as much. But normally when you're translating something to put out there to make available to other people, you have to walk a line between either option number 1, translating it essentially word by word, repeating what the language of origin says in your own language, which very frequently will result in some odd sounding sentences that may be very hard to understand. And then the other way of doing it is to translate the idiom, the meaning behind the source language's words, where you're not keeping it to exactly what the words are from the original languages immediately converted into your own. You're getting the idea behind what it is saying. Now, if you go more one of these ways than the other, then quite frequently you will be making an error by intentionally or accidentally, one would hope normally accidentally, you include something in your translation that the text does not actually support. This is usually going to be the problem where you get to translating what you as a translator see the text as saying rather than the other way where you translate it word by word. Word by word is generally going to be closer to the author's original writing, but in our language it doesn't make much sense. An idiom in one language does not transfer to another language very often, so it's better to mix the two types of translation together whenever you can. Say we have an English idiom like "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater." Translating that into another language will usually result in that sentence appearing in their language saying exactly the same thing, but since that language doesn't use that same idiom, it won't make as much sense in the new language. So usually what a translator will want to do is, up until something like that, you want to be as close to the original text as possible. But when you come to an idiom from the original language, you as the translator should have at least a decent idea of what the idiom means to the original speakers, and then you can substitute another idiom in your own language, which gives the same idea or supports the same thought. This is a difficult thing to do and can, as I said, often lead to error, skewing it away from what it originally means or what it is intended to mean. It's a hard thing to avoid, and this is one of the things that we're going to look for in the Latin text. Since the Greek text is the original, I'll be presuming that brain failure there. It's the original text that we have. We don't have an Aramaic version of John, so we have to treat this as the original source. The Latin Bible here, the Vulgate, is a translation of that, and it thus can fall prey to errors like shifting too much into the new language and thus losing the meaning of the original language, or sticking too close to the original wording from the original language and then losing all sense in the new language. There are other errors that you can run into. A major one that specifically one English Bible translation really suffers from, and that's illegitimate totality transference. So we want to make sure that Latin doesn't fall prey to that one. What that one is where you have a word from the source language. Let's take Catalaban. That's a good one. And illegitimate totality transference is when a translator finds a word like this, opens up their dictionary and looks and says, oh, hey, this has got a dozen different possible meanings. And then the translator tries to fit all of those meanings into how they translate this specific passage. So if we were to do that with kai he scotia auto u catalaben, we would have to somehow or other get the darkness to not capture it, not take it, not realize it, and not understand it, all in the same sentence. And sometimes it'll be actually pretty easy to fit all of the meanings of one word into a sentence. This one, I don't think that'd be all that easy. I can't think of a way off the top of my head to do it. But in doing that, you're inserting a lot of meaning into the text that is not there. Understand is the appropriate selection for Catalaban. Though captured, took, and realized, all of those are technically options, and the darkness did not capture it. It doesn't quite fit the context of the rest of these, the verses beforehand. And the darkness did not take it, same idea as captured. And the darkness did not realize it. Well, realize it, what does that even mean? In context, realized is, frankly, of all these four, the least sensible. It puts forward an idea, and as an American reader, I have no idea what's going on. And then we have, and the darkness did not understand it. And that one of the four best fits the situation. So illegitimate totality transference, that of our three errors we've talked about, is kind of a crazy one, where we would try to fit all of the different options for all of these different words into your translation. It just fails, and it horribly pulls away, usually, from how a sentence is actually going to, what the sentence is actually going to mean in English. So there are the three errors, the three major errors we are going to want to look out for. Sticking too close to the original language so that the meaning is lost in the new language. Sticking too, if you will, close to the meaning of the original language so that it is actually probably lost in the new language and skewed towards a specific idea. And illegitimate totality transference, where we try to stick all of the possible meanings into the new language. All right. Other than that, the other thing that I wanted to talk about is the controversy in verse 1 here. Kai theos ein ho logos. We don't really have much time to go into that, and I already talked about it beforehand, but there is a podcast done by a pastor, I think it's been 4 or 5 years ago now. I'm going to put a link to it in the description to the video. And it's a podcast. It's split into two different parts. The first part is where he goes and he looks at a whole bunch of different biblical passages about monotheism versus polytheism in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And then the second half of the podcast, which is probably the harder half of the podcast to even listen to, is a part where he reviews a sermon that a pastor did, and I think the pastor is somewhere from somewhere in either Oregon or California. I'm sorry, I don't remember which. And this pastor is teaching polytheism, and so he looks at this sermon versus what we just looked at in the previous hour, going through all these texts. So it's not about specifically these 5 words here, but it is about a very similar, a related topic of polytheism versus monotheism. So check it out if you have the time, and if you don't mind listening to some very good, but frequently very frustrating things. Okay, on to the text at hand. All right, so taking a look at these two texts together, we want to see that the Latin is properly organized in its own language, the Roman language, and yet it still gives the same ideas that we saw in the Greek. So our very first word in the Greek translation, our rough Greek translation, in beginning was the Word, and the Word was before the God, and God was the Word. We're not going to treat this in these videos usually. Okay, period. And then we take a look at the translation we got for the Latin. The Latin has no articles in the original, so we, for the most part, looking through it, we didn't write any down. There's not going to be any articles in our translation of this Latin form right now, which is fine. We can stick them in where we know it's appropriate based on the Greek. Article there, so we should put one in, article there, so on and so forth. But we're not going to do that right now. Articles are not going to be the big issue between these two. So, got that. And our Latin is, in beginning was Word, and Word was before God, and God was Word. As we take a look at the two texts, the Latin here, Jerome, in his translation, we've got corresponding clauses, prepositional phrases, and words to each other, and they are, for all intents and purposes, the exact Latin, I think it's cognates? Exact Latin cognates of their Greek counterparts. And they even say the same thing. In beginning. In beginning. We've got same tense of the verb here. The subject, Greek word for word, Latin word for word. The only difference is that Latin uses a neuter word and Greek uses a masculine word. So there's not really a big difference right there that we should worry about. And then our next clause is the same thing. We got pros ton theon. The best translation of that is before God. And apud in Latin is a preposition that means specifically before God. And we looked previously at other prepositions that could have been used in either of these languages. Meta could have been used instead of pros, or soon instead of pros in the Greek to give the idea of with, and cum is what we would have wanted in Latin had we wanted to say with. But no, here Jerome uses apud. Apud and pros with the accusative, they have the exact same meaning, which is awesome. Direct correlation right there. It's proper Latin, and it matches the Greek. So we look ahead. Deus est orum, theos ein ho logos. It's the same thing. Greek has the article, Latin does not. Verse 1, wonderful match. No real split between them, period. Okay, verse number 2. This one was in beginning before the God. Okay, this one was in beginning before God. Our translations, they again match perfectly. We've got the prepositional phrases in beginning repeated, in arche, and then apodam. Exact same phrase. Even the Greek has the repetition of prepositional phrases. You've got hutos here, and we've got hoc. Latin has a wider variety of demonstratives. Hutos in Greek is the demonstrative, if I'm remembering this correctly, that usually refers to a closer object. So, can you see that? There's my glass of water, and here's a pen. In Latin, we would use hoc to refer to the closer of the two, and ille to refer to the further of the two. In Greek, we would use hutos for the closer of the two, to the subject, or to the perspective, which is me, and we would use kenos for the further of the two. So, another wonderful choice there by Jerome. Hoc and utos. Hutos are very good representatives of each other. Okay, so now we can move on to verse 3. All things through him became, and without him became not one which has become. Okay, and then we get to, where did it go? All things through him became, and without him became nothing which became. Or we would say has become, because this is a perfect passive. And as we take a look at the two of these, we've got a substantive adjective right there, and a substantive adjective right there. They're both neuter plural, exactly the same thing. Big difference here, but this is a difference in how the languages work, is we have got a plural verb with, plural verb with a plural subject, and in Greek we have a singular verb with the plural subject. Greek does that, Latin doesn't. There is no issue there at all. Latin is being true to itself in this instance. Okay, dia, that's the Greek word for through and him. And we've got per, ipsum. Ipsum is normally a reflexive. So, in pondering here, if I remember correctly, and I could be wrong, autu is also sort of like a similar reflexive to ipsum. Per takes a different case than dia, but that's not a big issue at all. So these two are the same for all intents and purposes, same subject. Factus sunt is not aorist, as this one is, but then Latin doesn't have the aorist tense. This is a past completed action, and aorist here is also a past completed action. This is middle, so it gets a slightly different idea in the Greek than we can properly translate in English. And Latin, since there are a teeny number of words that can actually be in the middle voice, we can't, Jerome here couldn't really do that either. So the middle idea behind agenito, which did not make it into our English and frankly can't really, doesn't make it into the Latin. But that's not a big issue. It's this is essentially a failing of Latin, where Latin can't say the same thing as Greek. There's no way about it. And there's not really much of a need to either. Okay, and without him, choris. Choris is a kind of irregular preposition. It was normally an adverb, and I think the way it worked is in Attic Greek, and before that, it acted as an adverb, and then as the language evolved into becoming Koine, the Greek that the Bible was written in, the common tongue at the time, it had transformed it into a preposition. So that's just an interesting thing in Greek. Sine, nothing like that, as far as I'm aware, and that's not an issue in translation that we run into. They still correspond to each other. Same idea. Ipso, autu, ipsum, autu. Same use, the same demonstrative, same there also. Now we've got singular. In Greek, we have not one, and in Latin, we have nothing. But those two are equivalent ideas. There's no issue in that. We've got a relative pronoun there, and we've got a relative pronoun here. So that's good. Same verb, same verb. This time it is perfect active. This is still, still perfect also, so no issue there. Verse number 4. In him life was, and the life was the light of men. Okay, is that visible? Yes. So then here we've got, in him life was, and life was light of men. In ipso, in autu, ipsum, ipso, still consistent there. And we've got correct tense of the verb, life is the subject, light of men. Men are genitive of possession here. We've got genitive of possession there. It's a wonderful fit still, and I have to make sure it's still on the camera. We can move on to verse 5. We're almost done. Okay, verse 5. And the light in the darkness shines, and the darkness it did not understand. Okay, now to the Latin, which is barely visible, so we're going to have to cover the... No, better idea. There we go. And light in darkness shines, or will shine, and darkness it did not understand. So, I forgot to look up whether or not this was a second conjugation or a third conjugation, so I'm sorry about that. My mistake. Should have done that. I will probably be putting a note in the video to say which it actually is. So, based on the fact that this is a present verb, I'm going to assume that the future here is incorrect, and that this should be present also, so it's going to be shines. We have word for darkness here. In Greek, it's a singular word. In Latin, it's a plural. That is just another peculiarity between the languages, where the word in Greek is naturally singular when it's just talking about darkness, and the word in Latin, as we talked about in the very last video before now, it's just unique to that word and a couple other words in Latin where they appear naturally plural, kind of like the word pants in English. We wouldn't put on pant, we would put on instead pants, and it's a plural formed word even though it stands for a singular. Likewise here, so there's no issue between that and that. All right, shines, lucet, and fine, they both have the exact same meaning. If we are correct that this is not actually future, then they also are exactly the same in how they are formed. All right, okay, we've got autu, so we've got a repetition of this. Oh, you can't see that. Where's there? That word. But in Latin, we have a change of demonstratives to is, id. Now, is, id is a little bit wider in how it can be used than hic, haec, hoc, or ele, la, elud. So this is, in this instance, iam and auto, they don't match very well, but this word still has the same meaning in context as this one. So, again, there's no issue there at all. Latin is functioning properly. This is actually a better choice in this instance than would be ipsum, or, well, hoc would have been an okay choice. Okay, now, last bit, comprehenderunt. We've got an aorist here, and we've got a perfect here. They're both active. Aorist is a tense that Latin does not have. Perfect is about as close as Latin can come to the aorist. So they are roughly equivalent. Having perfects in the Latin versus having the aorist to the Greek does not change, as you can tell by our translation, it doesn't change the translation at all. It doesn't change the sense at all. So looking at these two texts with each other, the Latin does a wonderful job of staying true to its own rules. And yet it also does a very wonderful job of accurately transferring all 5 of these verses and what they mean and what they say. It can't handle the middle. It has no way of doing that with the verbs available to it, but nothing is lost by that. So, if we were to give a verdict on the quality of the Latin here, and we might do that from time to time, this one gets an A+ for being true to Latin, true to Greek, accurately portraying the original meaning from our original Greek. Okay, Internet. I hope taking a look at these two together was as useful to you as it was to me. And remember, context is king. Real quick, forgot to mention this earlier. Starting next, since we've finished this first paragraph, we're going to take in our next set of videos the following paragraph in John chapter 1. I believe this one is only 3 verses long. It's going to be 6, 7, and 8. So we'll take a look in the same way that we've done before. Take a look at the Greek first, and then the Latin, and then in a final video compare the two. Very similar to what we've done here between the two. And same methods. I might be changing around how some of it is set up if I can figure out a better way to do some of these things. And if in the event that there are actually people watching this, please, people, please, Internet, if you have any suggestions of how I could do this better, let me know. And see you next time. Creepy voice. Sorry.